Call to order this Thursday, August 29th, Oregon City Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee. Shall we start with introductions? To my right.
Bill Daniels.
Troy Bollinger.
Chris Cook.
Karen Morey.
Lisa Novak.
Alicia Hammond.
Jeff Sargent.
Phil Lewis.
Christina Robertson Gardner.
Thank you. And I think we had one excused absence, Mr. Doug Neely.
Yes, Doug Neely is not able to be here tonight. Neither is Derek.
Okay, very good.
Do you have the agenda in front of you on your screen? Or? Okay,
not,
so citizen comments on
pull it up.
issues and items not on the agenda. Doesn't look like we have any citizen comments. So that would move us on to general business, Beaver Creek Concept Plan Area Parks. And so to start off with that, today with us we have Christina Robertson Gardner, Senior Planner with Oregon City. And we're talking about, as we had her here a couple of months ago, to talk about the development of the Beaver Creek Area Concept Plan, and as a kind of general overview, and then she was going to come back to give a little bit more context as it relates to parks and the vision that we have for the park development, what's there, and how we go about with the acquisition of park space in the Beaver Creek Road Concept Plan area. So with that, I will turn it over to Christina.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for inviting me back. My goal tonight is to talk a little bit about where we are in the process for zoning code amendments and how you are involved in this little piece of the zoning and code amendments.
I guess we can turn down the lights.
Turn it on, that helps. There we go. So just the big picture, in 2008, the Beaver Creek Road Concept Plan was adopted. It was one of the 3 urban growth boundary expansion areas. What you see here is general bullets of what they adopted in 2008. What we are in now is, and my job has been, and planning's job has been, is to take a 60-page or 60-page narrative document with watercolor pictures and turn it into code. We have to require kind of a clear and objective process to, when people come in, to be able to share with them the requirements to develop. Right now, there's also a fair amount of properties that are inside the city limits but are holding their county zone, future urban 10 acres. And so this process will also rezone the properties that are already inside the city limits to their appropriate Beaver Creek Road Concept Plan zone. At the time of the 2008 Beaver Creek Concept Plan, it had between 1,000 and 1,600 housing units. Through the analysis we've been doing this spring, we have, our magic number is about 1,100. So that's the number of dwelling units we're looking at accommodating in this area. And the 5,000 jobs is what we see for the non-residential zoning opportunities. This was the map that was adopted in 2008. We call it the watercolor map. What you see is different different development districts. The light blue is more of the campus industrial. That's the zone we're identifying. The purple area is the mixed use corridor 2, which is kind of the area which is near and around Beaver Creek Road and Malala Avenue today. So a little bit higher office retail. We're allowing some additional industrial uses, so kind of a little bit of a hybrid. That big red dot you see right at Glen Oak Road is the neighborhood commercial 2-block Main Street. Kind of buildings right up to the street with sidewalk, cafes ideally, and parking in the rear. And then the 2 yellow colors are a combination of different densities of residential. But where you are at tonight, you'll see some green. And the the 3 things I'm going to bring up tonight and looking for kind of general direction and comments back to Phil as we move forward in this process. We have a linear park, which I'll talk about, and that is along the east side of the Holly Lane Extension, and Holly Lane Extension is parallel to Beaver Creek Road. There's the East Ridge Conservation Area, and that's kind of right at the Thimble Creek, touches kind of the Thimble Creek Canyon. And then there are some BPA power line easement trail opportunities. So 3 things I'm gonna lay out tonight. Our goal is to kind of tell you where we are today. It's not fully baked, but we want to get your feedback and recommendations and comments. And when it's ready to come back, we will provide you kind of 3 exhibits: Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C, and Exhibit A will be the 2 parks, and those will be added to the Parks Master Plan as amendments through this process. It'll be about a 1-page informational, think about a 1-page flyer where you have a diagram and some bullets that provide clarity, but enough flexibility that we can, be able to develop based on what's the parks, based on what, development applications come in. And then the trails, so exactly what the width of the trail is and what's going to be required. So those are the 3 pieces that PRAC really is going to be involved in, is kind of making that formal recommendation of those 3 exhibits. The coding and zoning amendments, the code and zoning amendments are currently at the Planning Commission level, and they are kind of all through the fall. We'll be having hearings, and we're having topics about every 2 weeks for each of the hearings. At some point after the Parks and Rec Advisory Committee has kind of made a recommendation on these exhibits, we'll share that to the Planning Commission. That will get folded in to the Planning Commission's recommendations that will go to the City Commission. And this final process, the City Commission will adopt new zoning for the area, adopt new comprehensive plan map, adopt new zoning code, and make any needed amendments to the comprehensive plan or ancillary documents to the comprehensive plan, which would be like the Parks Master Plan, the Trails Master Plan, and like the Transportation System Plan. So there'll be a big ordinance sometime in 2020 that has all of these as one big package. So we want to make sure that we do it right and get enough kind of that balance of certainty and flexibility in the Parks Master Plan for these parks. So where we are now is we took this watercolor map, and on June 7th, we have our proposed zoning map. And these are all available on our project website, which you can find on the planning page. And it's pretty close to the watercolor map. There's a few little tweaks, but they generally align to where we were in the 2008 vision. This is a map our consultant team this spring put together that kind of really overlaid the BPA power lines, the streams, the steep slopes, the geologic hazards, and in pink, kind of the overlay of this linear park. So you can kind of see there's a lot of development opportunities, but there's also a lot of constraints. So we've been working kind of how, as development comes in, we can regulate and acquire parks. So what we are doing, which is unique, we have not done so far yet in Oregon City for development applications, as part of this package, we will be writing code to do parks acquisition and dedication at time of a development application, which is which we haven't had really a chance to do because a lot of our development applications in Oregon City are really small, like 12 lot subdivisions or 20 lot subdivisions. You can't really exact a 3-acre park from a 28 lot subdivision. So usually what you do is you are looking ahead and you're finding park space, and it kind of happens parallel to a development application. Where in this situation, a lot of these parcels are owned by the same entity. So when development comes in, it'll probably be big chunks of development. And so this is a time for us to be able to proportionally exact park space. Not necessarily require them to build it, but to set that land aside as part of a subdivision application. So the goal really is to work with our attorneys and figure out what our limits of our proportional exaction are, how many dwelling units are as part of a subdivision application, how can we how can we use a mathematical, clear and objective formula to output how much land we can acquire. Let's, for example, you had a certain number of unit subdivision, 200 lot subdivision, or a bunch of multifamily housing, and you did your clear and objective metric, and output was 6 acres of parks. Well, we now would have 2 parks now adopted to the Parks Master Plan that we could then say we need the park space here, and we can acquire that proportionally. So that's the kind of things we're working on this fall, is getting that language right, getting the legal things right. That being said, Phil Lewis and the Parks Department can also do willing buyer, willing seller acquisition of anything above the required exaction. So it might be a little combination of your development application will require this amount of parks space, but willing seller, willing buyer, we may be able to augment that a little bit bigger. So we're trying to see what that combination is. We are still working on that, and Phil can share that with you as the hearings process goes on. So what I'd like to do now is kind of talk to you about the two parks and the trails and kind of what we're thinking on right now, what would be the exhibits that would be added to the parks master plan. Once again, this is just to get enough detail to acquire the park, and then there would be a separate parks planning process. So the developer wouldn't necessarily build the park unless there was some SDC reduction or development agreement, but it would provide enough detail to acquire the park. So the first one is the linear park Pearl and String approach. So on the left side of the screen, this is what the 2008 plan kind of showed. It really is this linear park that goes from pretty close up to just below Loader Road all the way down through the process on the east side of that Holly Lane extension. And what you see on the right is what our consultants translated that to. That's in pink. So what the linear Pearl and String we're kind of looking at is, in the plan, they talk about it's multiple parks could be in that overlay. And what we really want to see is a way to really connect the parks. So even in one individual park may not be a community-sized park, but to aggregate together, we consider all as one park. So it's really the String part is a ped bikeway, which would be on the east side of the Holly Lane extension road. So imagine, if you will, instead of having curb, 5-foot planter strip, 5-foot sidewalk, it would go curb 30 feet, and inside of that 30 feet would be a ped bikeway, and maybe it meanders a little bit. There might be some landscaping or a bench here and there, and that's the String. And then as development comes in, we can negotiate proportionally to put pearls in. So over time, you'll have the pearls that make up kind of the full park, but not every pearl will be built at the same time. But the String will be actually part of the right-of-way. So the pearls will be parks, and the String will be right-of-way. If that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So right now we're just kind of looking at potential bullets that we put in this exhibit. So once the first section is that 30-foot ped bikeway, we're looking at about 3 to 4 pearls of various sizes spread along that open space network. We think we want to have a minimum and maximum pearl size. We're not too sure yet, so any comments from the Parks and Rec Advisory Committee tonight would be nice. Also, a minimum combined size of all pearls we really see as a minimum of 8 acres. And that, I'll let Phil talk a little bit about the thought process that got to that.
Yeah.
And then we do want to have some minimum average widths and depths, just to make sure someone's not trying to give us a 5,000 foot long, 20-foot wide park. That's not what we want. So those are just some we got to get a real size park.
Yeah.
And then the other big piece, we want at least 5 acres to be developed with active recreation components. So some can be passive recreation, but we do want to put in the parks master plan that there's a certain number of acres that have to be active recreation components. And so additional bullets can be added to this, but it's always looking at that balance of flexibility and certainty. What do we really want to make sure is in there? Because when you amend something to the comprehensive plan and you don't want it, you got to amend the comprehensive plan in the middle of an application. So only put in the things you really think are needed to, really shape what this is. So that's the linear park and pearl. Maybe, Phil, do you want to talk a little about that?
Talk a little bit about that. So the conversations that we've had with planning is, what are we really looking to get out of our park system? What are the, we can set the stage for the developer, but they may, suggest doing a, 10-foot wide, 1 mile long. Like this is our park that we proposed for you. So looking at the minimum widths, some of the things that, Glen Oak Park or Wesley Lynn Park have about a 500-foot width, and they're kind of linear in nature to give you kind of a sense of both of those spaces as you're looking at the field space. We have a 3-acre minimum size requirement for our typical neighborhood parks. And so when we're looking at the pearl and string approach, are we okay with doing a 2 acre instead of a 3 acre, and then allowing additional, connectivity and knowing that you'll still get that overall minimum 8 acres of combined space? Does that provide enough of the active recreation components within that acreage to assume that you'll be able to have the types of amenities that the public's looking for within a neighborhood park piece of property? Do we want, again, to the active recreation components? This is a big piece for us. We've made some acquisitions in our history of providing park service that, developments near Berkeley Hills Park as an example. There is a small section where the playground is located, but then it very quickly goes into kind of a ravine. And so a lot of the acreage isn't really usable active recreation space. So really making sure that we aren't backing ourselves into a corner with things, but we want to be able to provide that active recreation space while at the same time still being able to provide some of those, natural components, being connected to some of the habitat areas or, NROD areas. It should be fine, but we don't want the whole park to be an NROD area where we're not able to provide the active recreation piece. So being able to give enough flexibility to the developer, but still be able to get the types of amenities we're really looking for out of our park system.
So the second park is kind of this East Ridge Park, and it's also called the Thimble Creek Conservation Area. And when you read through the Beaver Creek Road concept plan, this whole park is about a paragraph and 5 or 6 bullets. So, and when you read it, it's a little confusing about exactly what it is. And so actually what you see in the planning packet for the Planning Commission, our consultant staff actually wrote a version that is really private open space, but it tells you how you can get the intent of that park. And talking to Phil Lewis, I think there was a goal of the Parks Department to have this more as a public park. So that's one of the questions we're kind of sending back to Parks and Parks and Rec is, should we amend the existing proposed code to be more of a public park approach? And that would be really adopting this Parks Master Plan appendix. So let me tell you a little bit about how they describe it in the plan. And once again, it's the green area and then this X area. So this is to your left, the 2008 plan. And what you see on the right is what our consultants put together this spring. So they want 2 public viewpoints. They don't talk about the size. Oh, and let me explain a little bit. This is really fascinating. Maybe I can talk, yeah. So there is a Thimble Creek runs kind of at the bottom of the canyon right here. Can y'all see my arrow? And then the way our Natural Resource Overlay District runs is there's a NROD, a Natural Resource Overlay stream buffer on either side.
I think
That
that's
only
on
gets
the
you
right
about
hand.
halfway up the canyon. And then about elevation 490 is kind of the ridge. And so the way that you look at the plan, it says there's a gap here between the top of the ridge and the Natural Resource Overlay District. We want this to be a conservation area, and we want half of it to not be developed. It's kind of what it says in the plan. And so that is what that's what we started off. And I'll show you a little bit of one way this is kind of taking from the plan. They want 2 public viewpoints, generally one at the south, generally one at the north. Half of the area between the stream buffer and the 490 ridge line to be open space. But to make sure, once again, that you just don't do the whole thing right down below, they want at least a 700-foot non-interrupted view corridor right up along the ridge line. And to provide a forest trail from one viewpoint to another, so you kind of like dip into the hillside and pop back up. And that would be a forest trail, not a shared use path. And then staff recommends to indicate that this area is a public open space. So those kind of metrics would do when a development came in, we would say, okay, figure out where your road is, figure out where your homes are, because there's going to be nice homes on the ridge line, and they'll have geologic hazard review. But where's your 700-foot view corridor? And go do the math and figure out what that area is between the edge of the stream buffer and the top of the ridge line. and half of that's a public open space. And so really the open space is that half of that area, the 2 viewpoints, size to be determined. So that's something we can talk and come back and see like, what's the minimum viewpoint we would want? And then this kind of trail that kind of connects the two. So that's the East Ridge Thimble Creek Conservation Area. And that kind of would, in some sense, be, you could ideally take the Pearl and String shared use path of Linear Park and kind of end up at the southern end of this. So they do kind of connect up at the southern end. So that's the East Ridge Thimble Creek Conservation Area. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Phil?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay. Power lines, you'll notice there's a lot of areas in gray, and those are all BPA power lines. So when the BPA power lines are near where the Myers Road extension is today, they're all together, and then they cross, we have 2 different ones. And so, and then they come back together again. It's kind of convoluted. So this was always intended to allow, and this is all campus industrial zone to the north of Loader Road. This is always intended to allow, you can park underneath easements, you can put park underneath the BPA power line, you can put roads underneath the BPA power line, landscaping, as long as there's not trees, big trees. So we thought there is space to put a trail somewhere in here, but we also, the whole thing isn't a trail because as you can see, there's not a lot of white, and the white is where the buildings are. And so they want to maximize that area for the buildings, and how do we use parking and circulation can be more pushed towards these gray areas, and at what place makes sense to have this trail. And so I might pass it over to Phil a little bit to think what he's thinking of. My thinking is the kind of how do we create jobs in this city? This is one of the last and best places we can bring living wage jobs to Oregon City. So I'm always trying to figure out like how can we, as a Lego and the cookie cutter, how can we get this in? But also acknowledge there is a great opportunity for these east-west connections and to get people to walk, and people like to walk at lunch, how to get people to walk that's not Loader Road. So there's lots of ways, opportunities, and reasons why we want to have trails in this area. So right now our minimum recognition is a 30-foot trail width with a 10-foot wide paved path. Somewhere, so the first person in kind of starts to shadow plat, and we kind of take a look, and then that trail is there, but so is the road, and so is parking and site circulation for the other parts of the BPA easement.
And from Parks perspective, looking at these corridors, obviously there are some wide swaths, and we don't want to negatively impact the ability of the property owners to build out to their capacity to provide jobs and opportunities there. But with the trail system, we need to identify ways to provide open, accessible, safe feeling, even if they are safe in design, but just if you have pinch points or corridors that have build outs on both sides, as opposed to, a 30-foot wide trail design by itself is fine. But if you have an 8-foot fence on one side and, garbage receptacle area on the other side, it's not going to be very appealing for folks to use. So we want to make sure that we're identifying ways to provide these spaces in a way that they are usable and that they're an amenity for both the development for the businesses as well as residents and future people using these sites. So trying to identify ways to incorporate our check boxes for what those look like to ensure that we have a usable trail system. One thing that, when I was in the Dalles, we worked with Google to build out, and they had some very particular, security needs at their data resource centers. And, very strict measures that they needed to keep up on their properties. And it was directly adjacent to our riverfront trail system. And so trying to make sure that we had these corridors with setbacks enough for to have a sense of safety and security, even if the trail by itself was enough, but what's around the trail. And so really making sure that we're building in that conversation piece and what we can ask from the developers as opposed to needing to ask for, a 50-foot width. So instead, we'll ask for, the 30-foot width, but what are the other things that we really need to take into consideration as we're developing this trail system?
I have 2 more slides and maybe we can open up to a larger conversation.
Yeah.
So during this time, we went out to the public engagement this spring. We heard a lot from the public about the width of the road and was the right design and signals and roundabouts, which is better. And so we did, we actually asked our transportation consultant, DKS Associates, and we asked them a lot of those same questions. And if you're interested, that memo is available at the August 13th City Commission work session. It's all attached. And you can read that. We did go to the City Commission, kind of showed, provided what we've heard. And there's a technical answer and then there's the community answer. The technical answer is the 3-lane segment, 1 travel lane in each direction with a median turn lane with basically a planted median when you're not having a turn pocket, met the transportation requirements for the rezone. And it met the transportation requirements for the rezone with either signals at the major intersections like Myers and Loder and Glen Oak, or roundabouts. So on a staff answer, we had our what meets the requirements for this rezone, but we wanted to go to the City Commission because we know we had heard from them and other people in the public that they wanted more information about what does it mean to build a 5-lane segment, 2 lanes each direction, that same center turn lane in Beaver Creek. How much land would you have to acquire? How big is a roundabout? Can you build a roundabout through a normal land use process? Or would it have to be a capital improvement program? How big is a 5-lane roundabout compared to a 3-lane roundabout? So we are doing some additional research, and we're going to be going back to them either in October or November. And we're also reaching out to the public because we generally weren't opening up the concept plan. We're trying to implement the plan was adopted, but because we're looking at this piece, it's a little bit different. We want to reach out to the public again and make sure we have their comments. So there'll be additional public outreach opportunities this fall on this question, and we're learning more about kind of the implications of any of those scenarios of roundabouts, traffic signals, 3 lanes, 5 lanes. So I don't know how much that necessarily impacts the parks, but people like to talk about traffic all the time. So I wanted to give a little feedback of where we are on that and next steps. And once again, through this process, Planning Commission, City Commission, if the Beaver Creek Road cross-section or determination of what kind of, it's called intersection control, roundabouts or signals, we may amend the transportation system plan accordingly. So once again, it'll all be in that big bucket that the Planning Commission adopts by ordinance. And we want to make sure we have it right, because once we rezone, there could be a land use application coming in the next day, and we want to make sure we have the right street cross-section design so we can tell them what we will be able to require for their dedication. That's really all I have for updates. So I might send it back to Phil to have a little bit more of a conversation, and I can take notes too.
Yeah. So again, part of the reason to have this conversation today is to make sure that we don't have any unintended consequences and/or that the design criteria that we have in place for the Beaver Creek concept plan area kind of meets with our expectations for providing park services to our community. And so having those conversations around the connectivity piece, having those conversations around the developed active park spaces, our minimums, maximums, what type of park design would be required for the types of things folks would actually want to participate in our park system. And so that comes down to the minimums and maximums. We have a requirement or a goal within our park system is to provide 6 to 10 acres of park per 1,000 residents. And so looking at the overall kind of what we are anticipating for this area, again, we have kind of that 8 acres minimum is what we're looking for. Could be a little bit more. We have some additional kind of park amenity pieces, which would be included, you know, the multi-use pathways, the trail areas under the BPA power lines, as well as the conservation areas near Thimble Creek. And so I think maybe Christina might be able to speak a little bit more to the kind of overarching, I think in reading through the document, there's a sense that this concept plan area was a little bit different than some of the other areas that were.
Each concept plan area went through its own unique process. And all three of them are, they found their own little niche, right?
Yeah.
So like, Park
more
Place
of
is
a
all about like
nature.
unique design and alleys. And then, you know, South End is a little bit more green, but there's some, you know, design approach. Beaver Creek doesn't talk any about what the houses look like. They care all about what the streets look like and how green they are and what type of streets and stormwater. So it's just, each plan is its own, they have their own vision. And so it's how do you implement the vision of the plan that was adopted? And so this plan really looked at integrating new jobs with the college and the high school, and then providing a new neighborhood directly adjacent. So there's opportunities for people to walk to work, or opportunities for cross commuting. So people are leaving and coming, which helps get transit, because it's hard to get transit at the end of the line if you're not picking up anybody else. So having a two-way development pattern, so all this bringing Caulfield together, like having a new kind of complete neighborhood in the southeast part of Oregon City, those were all kind of the pieces of the Beaver Creek, along with this really goal to have low impact development and a lot of green stormwater approaches.
Yeah. And so looking at that kind of linear connectivity piece and the kind of development within a park kind of setting, so not necessarily park space, but making sure that you have those multi-use pathways, that you have the kind of the green approach to stormwater systems and how folks are interacting with the properties, I think plays well with kind of what we're looking to do here. And so for us as a group, you know, if there's any thoughts around, you know, the approach that we're proposing, if you have any feedback on the kind of minimums or maximums or safety considerations or amenities, kind of the size of the spaces to be able to provide the types of recreational amenities that you would envision in a neighborhood park system. And it's a little bit different than we typically do in the string and pearl approach, but those pearls really are going to be kind of that neighborhood park. And so imagine like some of our smaller, I guess to give context in space and size. So Filbert Run Park is about 3.5 acres. The DC Ladderette Park is just under an acre of the actual park space. The Glen Oak Park is about 9 acres total, and so you can kind of think, you know, you chop that in half, that's about 4.5 acres. You know, what can you provide in those spaces? What types of size of components are you imagining in those areas? And so if we have a recommended minimum of 3 acres and a 3 to 4 3 to 4 pearls approach, 3 acres, 3 pearls, that gives you 9, that's kind of built out. If we have a minimum of 2, you know, maybe they only do 4 total, all at 2 acres, or they do, you know, again, one that's 2 and it's a little bit smaller, and then they do a couple others that are larger, and they have 3 total parks that have that 8 acres. So is that reasonable? Are you comfortable with kind of that general approach? Are there any kind of minimum or averages that we should be looking at from a design requirement perspective that you can think of?
Please. So the conservation area is in addition to that minimum
Park
8?
1 and Park 2.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, that's steep and then it levels off. Is some of that level ground outside of the buffer for the creek?
Good question. We haven't done that analysis yet.
Okay, because actually my cottage cluster is near the ridge in the East Village. And
Which is now allowed by right as a permitted
Rose
use.
took me out for a
Yeah.
ride around the
So
property and
that,
picked
you
my
know,
spot.
to give you the answer, I think that 50%. So if, you know, the 50% of that gap can be an open space that's publicly owned, but there could be opportunities for a little bit of small infill in the not public space of that gap area. And I think the larger question is, we don't know how many units can be in that other part of the half, because the geologic hazards codes is going to look at it, and that's really site dependent. And if any developer came today, we'd say the same thing of like, tell us what you want to do, hire a geotech, work with our geotechnical analysis. You may be able to get one home in that whole area, you may be able to get 7, we don't know. You know, so that area that's below the ridge line is really dependent on a lot more information based on a proposed development and our geologic hazard codes, because that area is a historic landslide area.
I've seen the LiDAR of it.
And so, you know, there's a lot of additional work that can be done, and we wouldn't be guaranteeing any number of units until you went through the process.
For the string of pearls, to put it in perspective, how long, is that like a 2 mile or 3 mile or 4 mile? Like, that would help put in, you know, perspective in terms of, okay, a minimum of 2 or a minimum of 3.
Sure, I can do a little math here really quickly. Give me 1 second.
And then how many slice through points with major roads, whether it's Loder or Myers or.
1 second, I can get, well, you
Okay.
keep talking, and I'll do some math.
I have a question, and that is, what kind of time frame are we talking now? So we're going, you mentioned that you'll be doing some additional public outreach during the autumn?
Yeah. I mean, most likely, the planning commission will not be making any recommendation to the city commission till wintertime, and maybe even new 2020.
Okay.
What I like to, that's probably the direct question, but the other question is, I would say this zoning sets the table, and acquisition either happens on a, you know, when we wait for the development or through a willing seller, willing buyer. So we're just setting the table, and it's really the development community which will decide when an application comes in, when these parks both get acquired, and then, you know, is it a big enough project that it makes sense for them just to get system development credits to build some of it? Maybe they don't want to, maybe they'll pay, you know, that's all later negotiations at a proposed development application. But once, sometime in probably spring 2020 is when everything will get adopted. And I say that now, today, and everything is all subject to change through the public hearings process.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And another question, regionally within the Portland Metro Vancouver area, are there examples of, because like top of my brain, and I'm not sure, but like Fano Creek within THPRD, to me, as you're talking, it's in that Tigard, Washington County, Washington Square area. It sounds very similar to this. Same with Rock Creek area in terms of that string. But wondering if, you know, there's I know those are districts, but in terms of that incorporation of all these elements, it feels very similar.
I think it does. I think that, and Phil may know a little bit more because I'm not the definite parks expert, but I think the difference between Fano Creek, because there's a creek alongside.
Yeah.
And then also like you know, the Washington County, like the trails that are along maybe their own power line. I know there's a power line north-south trail, and there's some parks that connect up. That's probably a closer version, but then ours will just be, you know, instead of a trail along a little power line, ours is more like this path along a street. So it's the same but different. I mean, it's a corollary. I don't know if you have this is a more urban version of that.
Okay.
Where Fano Creek, I think there was a lot of existing development, and they found a way to get the creek, and they found to get the park. Or we're like whole cloth, like starting from the beginning. So everything is going to be very urbanized, you know, development. There's not a natural creek running here. We're creating the Pearl and String out of a golf course, out of a flatter area.
Yeah, and I would agree. I can't think of anything offhand that has I envision it with our kind of condensed corridor, that it's more of a trail system within a developed urban area as opposed to a utilizing some of those corridor areas that have a much wider, following the BPA lines and having more.
Okay, or
Yeah.
out by the airport in Hillsborough, they have a similar type of pathway through business zones. It's more
yeah.
urban. Okay.
Yeah. So the linear 0.63 is what I got from a very rough overlay of the acreage from the natural area. So are you looking at my
0.63.
miles from here?
Oh,
from
you already faster than me, sorry.
to kind of where the curve is.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Less than a mile.
And then maybe, you break it up, there's probably,
Looks like,
maybe break up between.
if I'm understanding.
Glen Oak.
This is
Yeah.
Glen Oak.
Because that's where
Like
it's
Glen
like,
Oak.
okay, what does that connectivity really look like?
And Meyer, like down.
It is, there's a T here.
Third one.
The next
Yeah.
question is like how many access points?
There's, what you see here are the main roads. Oregon City's subdivision ordinance has lots of smaller roads, so there'll be smaller blocks in here, but these large blue roads are kind of the main connector roads. And so you're really kind of like a third of a mile between, this is Glen Oak Road. I think it was about a third of a mile from here to about here. And then, so probably a little bit less from here. So this whole thing, you said about 0.6 mile, 0.8?
0.6, yeah,
Where
0.63
did you
from
start from?
from the natural area down
Oh, shoot,
to
what did I do?
the Jaberski Way crossing.
Oh, which is right here. So from here to here is about 0.6 mile?
Oh, okay, so it's a very condensed, short area.
The parks aren't next to each other, but they're not
Yeah.
way
Yeah,
far. I mean, you
one
can
of the-
easily, I mean, the goal is when it's all developed, you can easily like walk from park to park pretty easily with your family. And there'll be some development in between the parks.
Kind of like
And one of the components we talked about was just the ease of operations and maintenance for having, so many, that's one of the reasons why we have the 3 acre minimum is because we don't want these sites that are difficult to get out to mobilize, to get all your equipment off, then you have to get back and drive to the next park and do the exact same thing versus a larger park area where you can maintain it a little bit easier with the larger park area. And so with this, you're going to have that connectivity piece. You're going to have some, trailway, some pieces that you'll have to maintain along the way. You'll have the larger Pearl and then the next Pearl. And so it's kind of a connected space. And it gives us the opportunity, as we have had previous conversations around trying to provide that easily walkable distance from every resident to a park. This provides a way for us to provide that opportunity for all the residents within this area.
And within, like, for the string of pearls, because the different size specifications, possibilities, is there any thought in terms of minimum number of access points to be able to get to, let's say, that 3 acre
I
plot?
think you're gonna get that through our subdivision block
Okay.
design standards, which are pretty small. So just the subdivision block standards, which I can't quote off my head, but Oregon City has pretty robust standards. So just the street network will get you there pretty quickly. Was that your question?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so. Just so
I think some of our,
developers often, have different perspectives.
Yeah, so in
of-
Oregon City with the subdivision code, we can't really approve a situation unless there's like a cliff where you have to walk all around to get to the thing that's behind you. We really have, and so even if you don't have vehicular connections, we might require pedestrian connections between 2 areas. This is really flat. It's gonna be a really pretty traditional subdivision block pattern.
And then remind me, sorry, I have so many questions. Remind me for the street plan, and maybe it's not developed yet, in terms of the transit plan for like bikes, is that something that'll be incorporated on the streets, or is that something that could potentially be incorporated within this 30-foot wide connectivity that then has the 11, foot path or whatever? Because to me, that affects how that space is used.
Yeah, I think a ped bikeway is part of that, in that 30 feet, definitely.
Okay.
In Beaver Creek Road, we're looking at bike lanes. It'll either be, traditional bike lanes. We're actually even kind of playing around. Can we get a cycle track in? Can we have an off-site area? So our engineers are, we've given them some creative things to look at. Local streets are local streets, so bikes will be on local streets. This Parkway area, the Holly Lane extension, I think we do want the PED to be a PED bikeway. So bikes will not be on that part of Holly Lane. It'll be, maybe it'll be parking cars. I mean, you probably could still have bikes, it's a street. But we want that feeling that you could bike that whole section on a grade separated bike path.
And then as a visual person, 30 feet is a little wider than this room? Because I'm guessing this is about 25 feet? So just trying, okay.
Yeah.
And then in terms of current trends, that I know within Portland Parks, we're experiencing issues of mixed use paths with people on wheels, and then also people walking. A pace of a child or a dog is very different than a pace of somebody commuting versus a pace of a family out for a daily stroll. Yeah. So in terms of whether it's one path or if it's concurrent paths, so in terms of the width, that to me seems, along with benches and garbages and all those other things, thinking about, if that 30 feet, it becomes much narrower once you start thinking in a wider.
And I think to that point, the string and pearl approach with the mixed-use path areas, I would envision as maybe being a little bit different than the other corridor areas, so near the BPA lines where you maybe have some of those commuter kind of separated, but we can look at.
Yeah, I'll work with Phil. I know best practices is always morphing as people are actually fully engaging and using our, shared paths in Portland. So we'll kind of take a look and see. I mean, if it has to be widened, this is the time to do it, because we will be adopting a street section. Yeah. And that's, once we adopt that street section, that is what we can exact. And so we want to make sure we have it right. But we also don't want to, you can't just suddenly make up a giant one. So, what's the appropriate width for the things we want to get? Yeah. That would be attached, it would be part of the right of way, that'd be the string. And that is, it's a multimodal, way.
What about separate paths?
Yeah, I think, I'm not an expert on it, so I will definitely take a look and we come back, we can kind of say, based on what we heard and what we understand, and talking to, other park staff and other cities, what they found out, and, what we think, this is still going to be a neighborhood park. I mean, not that people aren't going to come to this from other places, but a lot of the uses are going to be people who are coming out of their houses in this area. So I don't think this is not Waterfront Park Portland, where they're having all this ped bike problems with all the bike commuters. So it's like, how do we learn our lessons there, but then scale it to what makes sense for what this area will be?
Because we have our regional trail kind of definition, and then we have our our neighborhood or community kind of connectivity pieces. And so this would be, I think the string and pearls approach along the corridor would probably be more in fitting with kind of more of the neighborhood approach, as opposed to more of the regional trails pieces, where you might want to really seriously look at having a, separation of the commuter traffic versus pedestrians and that kind of thing. And
bike and little kids are definitely different speeds. So that's absolutely, as a mother, I know that. I watched you watch your 4-year-old trying to bike, and then suddenly someone's like zooming.
A lot of that depends on design, though. If you've got, a curvilinear paths going through, and then you empty into a park space where you've got benches and other activities, that tends to slow down the cross-country commuters, and they're going to look for a different way to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, and that way very well may be Beaver Creek Road. I mean, there's kind of more commuters.
But I would also say, I'm not a big fan of roundabouts. They're not pedestrian friendly. It really, if you're trying to walk from one spot to the other, the best way to get from there is through a conventional, lighted intersection. If you have to walk quite a ways around a roundabout, it kind of discourages pedestrian activities. And I'm a little concerned about where this open space crosses some of these major roads is how you're going to get the people from one side of the road to the other side. And if you've got roundabouts going into that area, how that interfaces.
So these will be nothing inside this concept plan area warrants any signals. I mean, these will all be either stop sign, two-way stop signs, four-way stop signs. I mean, no stop signs depending on who's interacting with whom. So the only signals or roundabout questions are right here at Myers, Glen Oak, and then Loader, which is farther up.
Okay.
And so just to let you know, and this wasn't put in the slide, but the goal is to have only access to the Beaver Creek Road concept plan left turns being at these main intersections. So there might be some right in, right outs from smaller roads here, but we will not allow left turns, unsignalized left turns on, or unsignalized or non-roundabouts on Beaver Creek Road, going southbound. And one thing that does is that really preserves that parkway. So you actually, when you reduce the number of access points, you can get a lot more cars through. So your capacity greatly increases when you really reduce your access points. Is like we're learning when we do all these access control projects on Balala Avenue or Beaver Creek Road with all these existing driveways, it's really hard. But so that's, imagine really just these key few main places in and then right in, right outs for the other smaller streets.
Curious, does Oregon City ascribe to the complete streets concept? Where you have the reduced right-of-way widths, the more of the buildings right up closer to the, the idea is that you've got a constricted roadway, but you're actually moving traffic through.
Yeah, I think we do see all the tools in complete streets are really important. I don't think we've adopted that word.
Okay.
But, as we, I'm not a transportation engineer, but you talk to transportation engineers and you can build, a 5-lane road or a 3-lane road, but if you don't use any traffic calming, people will drive to the level that they feel comfortable in. So it's all about street design that can get, and so, I actually don't have an opinion on signals versus roundabouts. They have pros and cons, but what I'm hearing from people that are really excited about roundabouts are that when you are non-peak hours, and you might have all green lights on Beaver Creek, you tend to speed more. But when you are on non-peak hours in roundabouts, you have to slow down between each roundabout and you don't get up to speed again. So it could slow down the speed of cars on non-peak times that you may not have on those like nights and afternoons when all those lights are all lined up green because no one's using them. So there's different pros and cons, and as we go through the public process, we're going to have more links to PDFs for transportation studies and more background, and really this is one of those leadership and directions to the City Commission. So I encourage you all as individuals, feel free to make comment, get involved. We're going to have that public process that goes through. I know a lot of people have a lot of opinions either side, and then we'll bring those in with all that constructability and cost questions and actually just how much space. So we're going to give the City Commission a lot of data and a lot of information to let them kind of figure out next steps on it.
So going back, and I just noticed the 2008 date earlier, going back 11, 12, 13 years, some of this you're not getting tonight, but these streets are not meant to be alternatives to Beaver Creek. And the original recommendation was they be designed to be neighborhood streets.
Yeah, they're
not commuter alternates. The other thing, we dreamers, if this builds out in keeping with what some of the original input was, it discourages owning a car, or it encourages, there's work-live space, there'll be light industrial employment, there'll be residential. Part of the planning was that you could live and work on this property. And, if you need a car, it's to get out and go to Fred Meyer or something. But that within the concept area, it's walkable. It's not long distances. It is beautifully level. It's a golf course. But, and it's going to depend on the developers and what comes out of it. But, the original plan would discourage a lot of active traffic on those roads. And I'm hoping the final plan continues to do that.
Yeah, that being said, I always say as planner, more connections is better. So it's not that we're not cul-de-sacing this neighborhood. No. We will provide connections to the world outside because connections are better, but you design to make people have to work really hard to use those connections that are outside the area. So connections are good because you don't want to have pinch points, but you don't want to have those connections be easily used as the alternate. They need to, you got to work extra harder. Slow. You have to drive much slower. You got to work harder to have to use that as your secondary alternate connection.
So any other questions? Do you feel we're on the right kind of path for the design in this area for parks and green spaces, trails?
With what you have to work with, it seems like you're on the right track. Yeah,
Okay.
with what you have to work with, your constraints, yeah.
No, I appreciate, seems like you're taking a very proactive approach in how you're looking at this, so I like it.
I've always liked the linear park ideas. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited. We've for years in planning, everyone's like, we need a park, but like these, small applications come in, and we don't have any code, and we can't. So I just like this is probably one of our only main big opportunities to get park exaction as part of a development. The one thing, the other reason why we're writing all of this, which I didn't put in the memo in the PowerPoint, is. Since 2008, there is a clear direction of state law for clear and objective standards for housing, which basically says you have to create implementable zoning that is clear and objective, like math, like yes, no, this number, that number, to somewhere someone can fill out a worksheet or apply for something really easily, and there's not any discretion. That being said, somebody always can go through a discretionary path, which would be like a master plan. So if a developer looked at this and said, I don't really want to build this, I can go through a master plan process. They still have to show compliance with a comprehensive plan, and the concept plan, but it's more substantial compliance, not any particular thing. But as a city, we're required to find that clear and objective path. This whole concept plan assumed master plan implementation. We'd all negotiate and we'd figure it out and we'd draw some things and there'd be an agreement and it would figure out. That still can totally happen. But the hard part that I've had this spring and summer is, oh gosh, we wrote a whole plan thinking we could do something we can't do now. So we need to write this clear and objective path. And so really everything we're doing here is trying to write code for in lieu of negotiating where the park is going to go.
Makes sense.
Great.
Any questions, concerns?
Go for it.
Well, I encourage you all to stay involved, and if you aren't on our mailing list, go onto the project page, on the planning page, and put your email in, and you'll get an email from me every 2 weeks with the Planning Commission agenda and updates on what's happening, and the City Commission agenda. So if you do want to follow the process, it's a great way to be involved. We have over 200 people on the interested parties list, and they get on the e-blast.
Thank you very much. Very good presentation. Thank you.
And then the other items on the agenda, future agenda items. So if there's anything that we would like to add, I will say that to Bill's question about the Buena Vista House, we do have that on the agenda coming up for our next meeting scheduled for September 26th. So we will update the group at that meeting. There was a request to have a conversation at this meeting. I will say we had a presentation with the City Commission and received some feedback, not necessarily specific direction from the group, but definitely some feedback. And so we're kind of working behind the scenes to move that forward, and we'll continue to have conversations with the Friends of Buena Vista Clubhouse to look at next steps. But we'll have probably a more thorough presentation at our September 26th meeting. But if there's any other future agenda items that you'd like to add, I'd be happy to hear them.
Yeah, at the 26th meeting in September, Troy and I will be prepared to show the new format for the goals, the prep
great.
goals.
Oh, great.
I thought I had sent it to him a couple weeks ago, and I evidently had an email fail, so it's probably still in my outbox. So, but we should have that ready for presentation then.
Yep.
On the Buena Vista House too, if you haven't watched the meeting from last week, please feel free to avail yourself of the video online. It's informative.
Entertaining.
It's informative.
So with that, our future meeting again is on September 26th. This is our next meeting. And
Meeting adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Oh.